Okay, we are. Okay, so good evening and thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Christina Culp and I'm the director of MARSH, and that is the chapter of the North Carolina Wildlife Federation in Union County that is on the zip code 28173. But we welcome everybody. We don't care what your zip code is. We're just trying to share information with people. So our main mission is to engage the community and educate them about the benefits of restoring and protecting wildlife habitats. If you live in this area, you know that it is constantly being changed by roads and housing developments and businesses and all that. And so, you know, all of those things kind of really stress, I'll be nice about it, stress the wildlife habitat. So, you know, we're trying to build back whatever we can. If you are a member of the North Carolina Wildlife Federation or become one in the future, you can select MARSH as your donor recipient, and we will get half of whatever you donate to the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. Also, if you would like to be part of the MARSH planning group, we are always looking for help so that we can have more events like this and more in-person events as well. And I'll talk about a couple of those things that are coming up later on. If you're interested, I'm going to post our email address in the chat box. It's marsh4, the number 4, wildlife@gmail.com. And you can get in touch with me or one of the other people on the planning committee, and we can absolutely help you out, and you can help us out.
Or was it?
We would also love to hear your thoughts about tonight's presentation, any questions, comments, and any ideas that you have for future presentations, future topics. Please put those in the chat box throughout the whole evening. That would be great. We are, like I said, we are recording this, and you will be able to find this presentation on our YouTube channel, hopefully by the end of next week. It takes me a little while to get them done. Before I introduce tonight's guest, I wanted to tell you about some things that are upcoming. On 5/21, Marvin will have its first ever Marvin Day celebration. It's going to be an all-day event. So if you're in the area near Marvin, which is near Waxhaw, North Carolina, we will start the day off with a 5K. Not all of us, but some people will start it off with a 5K. And we will also have garden tours and artists in the park. We'll have nature walks in the park, a car show, band, and fireworks toward the evening after dark. And so it's going to be a big event. And it's all free. So join us, please. Over the summer, we're hoping to join with the other wildlife chapter in Union County. They're called the Union County Wildlife Chapter, and host a moth night. It will probably be more closer to Monroe. But if you've never been to moth night, it is a fantastic time. So basically it's after dark and you put out kind of like black lights, and the moths show up, and you get to see some just crazy interesting moths things that you've never seen before. It's just really fun time, and it's after dark, so it's cooler in the summertime. So we'll have more information about that coming up soon. And also, based on our last presentation with Frank Vasco talking about nature photography, we're working with Frank to host a nature photography class, probably at Marvin Park, and that'll be later on in the summertime too. So again, keep in touch so you can find out about those things. You can check us out on Facebook or that email address that I just sent. If you want to know more about Marvin Day, you can go to marvinnc.gov and you'll find all the information you can think of there. So on to tonight's presentation. Tonight, Susan Campbell is joining us to talk about hummingbirds. And, you know, I don't think there's anybody who doesn't like hummingbirds. They're just so cute and interesting. And, you know, so it was a great topic, and we have lots of people here that are interested to hear about this. Susan is a wildlife ecologist, and she's worked across North Carolina with a primary focus on birds, and more specifically on hummingbirds, ruby throated hummingbirds. So for over 20 years, she has been studying ruby throated hummingbirds year round, as well as overwintering hummingbirds in the colder months. She's very involved in the North Carolina Audubon, North Carolina Partners in Flight, and sorry, I'm muting some people, and North Carolina Wildlife Federation. And she leads regular birding events, trips from the sand hills all the way through to the coast, and very different birds in all of those. I and possibly the need for another presentation in the future. She has birded internationally. So she's been to Europe, Central America, the Caribbean, South America, Iceland, and the Galapagos. I mean, each one of those could be its own presentation. So it sounds like we would love to hear about that stuff someday too. So back to the topic for tonight, we're going to talk about, or Susan's going to talk about, the natural history, identification, and movements of the ruby-throated hummingbird across North Carolina. And she'll give us some ideas about how to provide for hummingbirds and dispel some of the common myths. So we'll handle questions at the end. You can put your questions at any time in the chat box, but we'll handle those at the end. And we should be wrapping up around 7:30. So thank you all for joining us, and welcome, Susan. You can go ahead and.
Thank you. All right. Let me share my screen. And see if we can't get our first slide up.
And if everyone would mute, please, so that we don't have any background noise. Thank you.
So this is fantastic to be doing this for you all. I've never spoken to the group before, but lots of groups that I am able to speak to every year, a lot of new folks every year. And thanks to Zoom, you know, I can do these presentations and reach out to more people than I would in person. As much as I love doing in-person presentations, being able to take advantage of Zoom means that I can do a lot more talks and reach out to a lot more people than I would in person. So I really appreciate being invited to speak for you all tonight. Unfortunately, the topic at hand is one that is pretty complicated and complex. So what we're going to be talking about tonight is only sort of the beginning. I have a little bit of time here to just give you an overview of hummingbirds in North Carolina, and we're specifically going to be talking about hummingbirds at this time of year during the summer, during the breeding season. That's what we're going to focus on tonight. The whole idea that hummingbirds are here in the winter, the wintering phenomenon of hummingbirds, is something we'll have to wait for another night. We're really going to be focusing on what's most apt at the moment, and that is our ruby throateds here during the breeding season. So without further ado, I will move on. I do have affiliations with more than one organization. I really do work for a number of entities during the course of the year, but primarily I am a research affiliate with the Museum of Natural Sciences, so that my research is something that is part of the state endeavor to understand birds. But also more recently, I am the science director for the Cape Fear Bird Observatory. The Bird Observatory has just come into being within about the last year, and you'll be hearing more about this down the road. Although we are focused for the moment in the Wilmington area, we really do want to encompass the whole Cape Fear region. And quite honestly, there are a lot of endeavors, including my hummingbird work, that's going to be happening statewide. So although we're focused and our beginnings are out there in New Hanover County, we're really going to be expanding and exploring and involved in other parts of the state as well. So I'm a person that in some ways is in transition right now in terms of how I'm doing what I'm doing and the information that's going out. My website, for instance, is going to be shifting to the Cape Fear Bird Observatory website soon. So there are some things that are changing, but it's all good. It's all good.
Susan, your slides are not showing up. Like
they're not coming up. I just did.
Yeah, hit that button there.
That's exactly what I did.
Okay.
Let's go back here.
There we go. Perfect.
Okay. Is it there now?
Yeah, sure is.
Okay, good. So all you missed was you missed a picture of a hummingbird, and now and what I just said about what I'm doing. But this is just a little bit more about the observatory for those who are interested. And we do have a lot of things up and going. We do have a Facebook site. We have Instagram, we have a Twitter account as well. And of course, we do have a website where you can go and check us out. We're selling t-shirts and doing all kinds of fundraising already, but just getting going with that. So we're very excited to be getting started with a bird observatory here in North Carolina. It's something I've dreamt about for years, and I'm just so thankful to be part of this endeavor. And the hummingbird work is definitely a big portion of what the observatory is about, for starters anyway. So hummingbirds really need no introduction themselves, because they are just so fascinating to people of all ages, from young people to, I've had folks in their 90s that have just been moved to tears when they've been able to see a hummingbird up close, when they've been at an event with me. It really is something that is just so magical. It's a very magical creature, and there are people that are not bird watchers by any stretch that are fascinated with hummingbirds. And so I feel very privileged to be able to work with them. I really do. And not many people get to see hummingbirds up close. The little guy in this photo here has a hummingbird on his finger that got caught in the garage in the summertime. And I'm sure there are at least a few of you who've had this experience of finding a hummingbird buzzing around in your garage. And if they get tired, they will come down and you'll be able to get them out. The other way to get them out is to use a feeder in the doorway to lure them towards the door, and in that, then they will predictably fly away towards the light and out of the garage. But the reason they end up in garages so frequently in the summer is because most of us have an electric garage door opener that has a pull cord with an emergency, a red knob on it. And that little red knob gets these birds' attention, and they come in to explore, and then they get stuck because they don't understand when they go to fly away, they encounter this thing called ceiling, which is not something that's a part of their world, and it confuses them and it traps them. So occasionally, there are individuals that get the opportunity to see them up close because of accidents like this, but generally speaking, they are out there flying around in the world doing their own thing. And hummingbirds really are just so amazing. They are the only birds that can truly hover, but there are a lot of other things about them that make them so amazing. They have these adaptations that are physical adaptations that are very unusual, that are not really shared by any or many other birds. And one of them, in addition to being able to hover, they're the only birds that truly hover, is this fact they have a very, very long tongue. And that tongue is actually, as you can see with this bird, it's twice as long as the bill is. What that means is hummingbirds can reach down into flowers that other critters cannot. And they've evolved with flowers that are very long and tubular, such that they're the only ones that can reach down there and in turn pollinate those flowers. But what's interesting is that this tongue is so long that it doesn't fit in the bill. What hummingbirds have adapted is a groove in the top of their skull, and basically the tongue attaches to the back of the head. And so half of it is stored on the top of the head, and then the outer half is stored in the bill. Actually, woodpeckers have the same sort of anatomical arrangement. It is pretty curious. It is pretty interesting, but it is, yes, what allows hummingbirds to get down into a variety of flowers, even if they've got very long tubular blooms. But with hummingbirds, it's the color that tends to get people's attention. However, this can also be rather confusing. Hummingbirds are colored by virtue of iridescence, and that means they have physical features in their feathers that refract and reflect light and produce the color that our eye sees. And it depends on the angle of the sun in terms of what you actually see when you're looking at a hummingbird. And you can get an idea of this of these two males that are sitting on this feeder. The one on the right is basically shaded from our view. So it basically looks green, black, and white. And actually, if it was fully shaded, say under a porch where there isn't the amount of light that there happens to be in this situation, you might just see a black and white hummingbird. The bird on the left, however, has got some light that is hitting the throat, what we call the gorget in the males. And so we're seeing some color on that bird on the left-hand side. I've already gotten a few calls this year about folks who think they have a different kind of hummingbird at their feeder because they're seeing these males in the shade and they're only seeing black and white hummers. It's just really a matter of the lighting in terms of what you see, especially the color in their throat. And depending on the angle of the light, it may be gold, it may be purple, maybe magenta, but if it's fully illuminated dead on, you're going to see that bright ruby red color. And it is only the adult male ruby throateds that have the ruby red throat. The females do not, and the young of the year will not. So they have to be full adult males to have that ruby red throat. And that ruby red throat is very important for these males. The male ruby throats are the first ones that will have returned to your yard, to your neighborhood. Probably the very first ruby throats we see here in North Carolina are actually migrants that are heading to the northern part of the range. And we find ruby throats breeding in the summertime here in the east of the Mississippi, from North Florida all the way up into Canada. And they will basically be found, although not as commonly as they are around here, they will be found as far north as there are trees in Canada. They need trees for nesting. So when you get beyond tree line, then ruby throats are not going to be there. But we have had lots of birds pass through North Carolina that are heading way far to the north for breeding this summer. But our breeding males should be here on territories now. They have come long distance from Mexico or most likely Central America. They do have a large wintering range down in the tropics, and we know that there are ruby throats as far south as Costa Rica. They don't make it quite into South America, but they can be found well down into Central America as well as Mexico. So they've been there for the winter and they are now back. Our first returning males typically are documented at the very end of March. And for most folks by now, you have seen at least one adult male ruby throat. They can come back ahead of the females by a good 2 weeks. So they are definitely long distance migrants. They migrate during the day. They are flying at about treetop level. They're using powered flight. So they need a lot of energy to get here. And we know from what we see in the fall, we know that it takes them having a lot of insurance in terms of fat to make that long journey. They basically, when they leave the tropics, are going to almost double their body weight in order to make the trip. And when they're coming north in the spring, believe it or not, they go across the Gulf to get back to the southeastern US and then make their way north from there. In the fall, we think they follow the Gulf Coast around, but in the spring, they actually not only have this long trip to make, but the beginning of that trip happens to be over open water. And so they are going to be flying nonstop for maybe 12, 14, maybe 16 hours, depending on the wind and where they leave from. So they have this capacity to gain weight in order to make it through migration. So the males that you're seeing now are almost certainly breeding males. And so they're getting down to finding a primo piece of habitat in order to settle in to be ready for when the females return. Hummingbirds also, in addition to these fancy feathers, they do a lot of fancy flying, and that's because they cannot sing like our songbirds. They can cheep and chirp, and they make noises with their wing feathers as well. But because they are not songbirds, they have to use other tactics to impress the females. And for hummingbirds, that means fancy flying. They can flare their throat feathers to look impressive. But more than anything, it's displays that they do that will impress the females. So the first thing a male has to do, he gets back here and he finds a primo piece of hummingbird habitat, and usually entails an area that's more moist, that's a little wetter, maybe around a bottomland forest or a creek bed, or maybe even just around a farm pond where it's a little bit wetter. where he knows the females are going to be looking for a mate. And he will set up there and he will wait. And when the females arrive, he will begin to do a U-shaped display in front of the female. And you may not see them doing this. I rarely see them doing it, but I will hear them doing it, because when they're doing that display dive, as their wings change direction, as they are literally changing direction, there is a zinging sound that the feathers produce. And so you're going to hear kind of a zing, zing, zing as they make that U shape in the air and change direction. The females, as they sit there on a branch in front of where the male is, if they're impressed, or at least they don't fly away, the male will get in front and do a shuttle display. And this entails very fast back and forth flight right in front of her nose. And you'll hear, again, you might not see this, but you'll hear their feathers when they change direction, and it sounds then more like a zip, 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 zip. And if that female's impressed and figures he's a good candidate, she will allow him to breed with her, which takes literally about 1.5 seconds. And then she will leave. Hummingbirds are not a group that pair bonds. The adults do not have even a seasonal pair bond. That means that the females are doing all of the brood rearing themselves. The males are out there to look handsome, attract females for breeding purposes, and that is it. They take no part in anything having to do with raising the young. So this male, when he's here at this time of year, and from now until the beginning of July, all he's doing is looking to impress females for mating purposes. And again, this fancy flying that he does is because hummingbirds, they're cruising around about 35 miles an hour standard speed. But when they're doing their display dives, they've been clocked up to 90 miles an hour as they're flying, as they're dropping through the air and using powered flight at the same time. It is really pretty remarkable. They can fly forward, backward, upside down, sideways. They can do it all. They are extremely maneuverable. And that's because of the fact that their wings have very unique anatomy in terms of how they attach to their body. They not only can do this hovering, which requires about a figure 8 type motion of their wings, but they can move them independently of one another to be able to maneuver in dog fights where they chase one another or they're chasing a predator away, but to be able to fly in every direction, and then of course to also be able to hover. They are the only birds here in this hemisphere that can do that, and they do it very well. Hummingbirds, by the way, live about 3 to 5 years on average. We have found females through banding data, females that live considerably longer. We have 2 different females that have been documented as living over 9 years, which is really pretty amazing. The females are in a lot of ways a very different animal than the males. First of all, they are larger in body size. They can be up to 50% larger. Usually they're about 30% larger. And we think that that additional bulk is necessary in order to allow them to have the energetic capability to do all of this family raising work. So they are a bit bigger. And in the spring in particular, they can outcompete males around food sources. And I see this at feeders, where they outmuscle the males that are feeding in a particular sugar water feeder. And that's not hard for them to do with their size and also their determination at this time of year. They don't have much of a sense of humor because they have a lot of work to do. Not only do they rear one brood here in North Carolina in the summer, we believe that they certainly are capable of raising 2 broods here in the summer. And that would be a brood being 2 youngsters. And as I said, the females do all of the work. Once they get here, which they will be any day now, getting here, they will settle in. They may use the same area that they used last year, the same tree even, for nesting this year. They will pick their spot, start building that nest, and then they'll lay 2 small white eggs about the size of black-eyed peas or small jelly beans, and they'll incubate for about 2 weeks. And then when the young hatch, they will be fed by their mother for a good 3 weeks, maybe longer, depending on how good the food reserves are in the area. So she's got a lot of work to do. And if she does that twice, it means she's going to get down to business again, starting that second brood at the end of June, beginning of July, so that she has a second set of young that are going to appear in August. The first brood tend to show up somewhere between the middle to the end of June. And then, yes, you'll have a second brood here in North Carolina that show up that you notice on the landscape sometime late July, tends to be more like early August. So she's got a lot of work to do when she gets here. And also, you notice she's not as brightly colored as the male because of the fact that she needs to be well camouflaged in order to be invisible to predators. These little birds are not really capable of defending their nests or their young against predators. The idea is to be invisible. And you notice that nest that she's built there is very well camouflaged. She has literally put pieces of lichen on the outside of that nest in order for it to look like it's just part of the branch. And she herself looks maybe just like a leaf sitting there. She will be motionless when she is on the eggs or brooding the young in order not to give her and her nestlings or her eggs away. Another thing you'll notice about that nest, if you can see just there on the right-hand side of the nest on the branch, on the uphill side of the branch, they use a lot of spider webbing in their nests, not only to glue the nest to the branch, but also in the nest itself to hold the soft materials like cattail down and pampas grass fluff together. The thing about it is not only is that spider webbing really good natural glue, but it also stretches as the babies grow. So the nest can accommodate them as they get larger and larger. And you can see these 2 babies here, they are not fully grown. It's probably going to be almost a week before these 2 are ready to fly away. But you can see how the edge of that nest is stretching out to accommodate them so that they still can sit there safely in that nest, even though they're much bigger than they were when they hatched. And that nest will continue to hold them and stretch, but they will barely fit in there when the day comes that it's time for them to fly away. But the mom is going to be feeding them food pretty much nonstop from sun up to sundown. They do a lot of begging. She does a lot of work finding them food in order for them to grow quickly and to be healthy and be ready to fledge as soon as possible. This nest was actually in a tree that was outside of a bedroom window of friends of mine in Pinehurst, and another friend of mine took these photos. This female was successful at raising these 2 and actually started her next nest in the same tree, but on a different branch. And this is not surprising for these birds. When they find a good spot, they will take advantage of it. If they are successful in raising that first brood, they will nest nearby without a doubt. That nest cannot be reused. It is going to be a stretched out, messy affair by the time that the birds take off. And one of the interesting things about young hummingbirds, probably the most amazing thing about young hummingbirds, is that most of what they need to know to survive is passed down genetically. It's hereditary. They do some learning, there is some trial and error, but what they need to know is pretty much hardwired, whether it's how to find food, how to find their way around the neighborhood where they hatch, everything down to when to migrate and where to go. It is all innate. The female does not spend much time, if any, with her young once they leave the nest, showing them the ropes. In fact, with this first brood, she is going to be in a hurry to start raising family number 2 as these youngsters, older youngsters, are still growing. We have documented in North Carolina female ruby throats working on nest number 2 while they're still feeding babies in nest number 1. The summer is not very long for these birds, and the females are very busy in order to pull off raising 2 broods here in North Carolina. So like I said, the first ones will be leaving the nest in mid-June to late June, and then the second brood is usually in early August when we see them show up. So here in North Carolina, in terms of activity of ruby-throated, when they get back, when the males get back and the females get back, you're not likely to see a lot of activity at your feeders because these birds are out there breeding and doing their breeding thing away from your feeders and probably your flowers. It's not going to be until the female is feeding older nestlings that she's going to be looking to use a feeder very much. And likewise, the male won't really use feeders a lot until the summer ends for him. It's interesting because in July, to me, where I am, no matter where I am, it's noticeable. All of a sudden, adult males show up at feeders, especially, or at flowers, and are very noticeable because they have now nothing to do until they migrate. They'll sit around, they'll scratch, they may start molting some of their feathers. They'll just kind of sit around and eat and not do a whole lot else until later in June, when, believe it or not, they do begin to migrate. But for the females, they've got a long season of tending to babies. And so for them, until about mid-August rolls around, they are very busy. But yes, they raise 2 sets of 2, and they tend to be pretty high up in the vegetation, although we do have instances of ruby throats nesting places closer to ground level where they're easy to see. But generally, they are pretty invisible, and that's the name of the game for these birds, is to be invisible so that their young have the best chances of surviving. I don't know of too many people who've been lucky enough to find hummingbird nests because they're tiny and they're well camouflaged, and more often than not, they're pretty high up in the trees. You can see with this nest, it's pretty typical one where it's on a down sloping branch and it's often out towards the end of a branch. So it's going to be harder for a predator to get out there. Something like a squirrel, that branch is not going to support its weight. So unless it's something like a blackbird or maybe a smaller climbing snake like a rat snake or a corn snake, this nest is going to be relatively safe from predation. However, with hummingbirds, we know that the bulk of predation happens to these nestlings. Once they're flying, the odds of them being depredated by something go down dramatically. So they're most vulnerable when they're in the nest. And that's, again, what behooves them to be invisible. And believe it or not, even these large nestlings here, when mama's not there, they are going to be motionless on that nest so that they don't attract attention to themselves. And this, again, is all basic instinct. It's not something they're taught. It's just something that they do. When young of the year are flying and showing up at your feeders, it may or may not be easy to tell that that's what you're looking at. Young females, very hard to tell from adult birds unless you know the subtleties of the plumage to look for. The young males, it's a little bit easier because, like this bird here, you will notice that young males have at least 5 o'clock shadow in their throat where that gorget's going to come in next year, and then they'll look like their dads. They'll have that 5 o'clock shadow. They may have 1 or 2 or 3 or sometimes more red feathers already sparkling in their throat. This bird, I suspect, has a few red feathers in the very center of his throat. But for the most part, he's going to look like his mama. He's going to look green and white, and he's going to have that double rounded tail. I didn't show you, but on the adult males, they have a forked, longer, jet black iridescent tail. This bird's got a tail just like his mama's. And there's some theory that, well, maybe if they look like females, the adult males are not going to gang up on them. They're going to have an easier time of it. So that they will have an easier time finding food and just basically learning how to be a hummingbird without being bombarded by the adult males. That may be part of it. in any event, they have some other subtleties. You see that this bird's got a little bit of peachy color on his sides, and that is another trait of immature ruby throats. They can actually have more color than this bird is showing here. It can be anything from peach to an actual rufous color. And males and females, young males and young females, show that. Also, you can see on this bird's forehead, his feathers look dusted, and that's because he actually has little white fringes on his crown feathers. And those fringes will wear smooth within a few to several weeks. One of the things I look for to see if a bird is very young is those fringes. Those fringes don't last long. They'll wear off pretty quickly. So there are ways to tell these youngsters apart, but it's no surprise if you look out your window in July or August when things really heat up, when we get to the peak of hummingbird abundance here in North Carolina, and you're seeing mostly green and white hummingbirds. You're not seeing birds with red throats. And that's because the bulk of the individuals you're seeing are young birds or females. In the adult hummingbird population, ruby-throated population, there are right now, as we speak, more females than males. The adult males are in the minority, and that's okay in the ruby-throated world because of the fact that, as I've already said, they don't pair bond. So we don't need to have one male for every female. As long as there are enough males out there for the females to find for breeding purposes, it works. But in the young of the year, the population is skewed in the other direction. There are more young male ruby throats produced than young females. So a lot of those young males just don't make it for various reasons. But yes, you're going to see a lot of green and white hummingbirds in late summer, and those are a mix of youngsters as well as adult females. And they are all aggressive, whether it's an adult male in this picture, whether it's two youngsters, whether it's females. Ruby-throated hummingbirds are just very aggressive by nature. Fortunately, most of the time, this situation does not occur, that it's just bluffing. It's vocalizing. They are all just talking at one another. They're chipping, they're chirping, they're posturing. They may be doing some fancy flying to try to intimidate one another, but there isn't physical contact involved. For hummingbirds, physical contact when they're fighting is very dangerous because that bill is very vulnerable, sticking out the way that it does. And that bill is critical to their survival. If the bill should break, they are done for, because the bill, although it can heal if it's abraded, if it breaks, it cannot heal. So getting into a situation where there's a physical fight and endangering their bill in the process is a really bad idea. But there are times when I do hear hummingbirds body slam one another when things get really heated, and it really does kind of, it sets the hair on the back of my neck up when I hear that. But it is not common. It is really more the case that they just kind of chatter at one another and may try to puff up and intimidate one another, but there isn't physical fighting involved, because that's just really, really dangerous for these birds. Late in the summer, in addition to a lot of hummingbirds being around our feeders and our flowers, I also get reports of white hummingbirds. And depending on the year, it may be one report, it may be 2 or 3 or 4 reports. Last year we had 2 different white hummingbirds that I'd heard about. In 2020, there were 3 or 4. White ruby throateds are something that do occur, and when they occur, we notice them because they are so noticeable. And most people love their hummingbirds, so they're watching and they see these birds. White hummingbirds tend to be either partial albinos, like this bird, where it's not completely white, but it's got a number of white feathers. In fact, the majority of the feathers here are white. Or they may be leucistic, meaning they're a tan color or a gray color all over. That's far more common than seeing a hummingbird that's a full albino like this one, that has no pigment in the bill or the feet, in the soft body parts. The eye is a dark red, as you can see here, and they have all white plumage. It's really pretty rare, but it does happen. And these are individuals that I'm interested in studying if I can, but so often migration has already started, and so often I'll hear about them after they've already left, or I'll hear about them and make plans to go see if I can see them and maybe study them. And then I find out that they left yesterday and I'm a day late. Fortunately, we have people, when they're excited about these hummingbirds, they are able to get good pictures. That's what's great about digital technology, is that folks can send me pictures just from their phone, oftentimes, of their hummingbirds, and they're very valuable pieces of information. So in terms of the white hummingbirds in North Carolina, many of them have been photo documented. I've only banded about a dozen. It's a really tricky business, especially tricky if I get someplace and there are lots of ruby throats around still. It's like early August, and I'm trying to catch one hummingbird to study it and to put a band on it amongst dozens. It is really tricky, if not an actual exercise in futility. But anytime I hear about one, I do try to get to it to study it, because we don't know much about these white birds. One thing we know is that they're all young of the year. They are indeed young of the year. And we think that they don't survive long because white feathers on any bird are very brittle. Think about it. White feathers, brittle. This bird's lifestyle means that those feathers are going to get abraded badly pretty quickly. So their ability to survive with feathers, especially when you're thinking about a bird that migrates thousands of miles in the fall, it's just not likely that they're going to be able to survive for very long, covered with white feathers. There's a mixed opinion about whether or not they can be picked off by predators more easily. As I said, predators picking off flying hummingbirds, it does happen, but it's not very common because of the fact that these birds are moving so fast. And they're also just flat out, they're not a big meal for any critter, especially a flying bird like a bird hawk. It's just not something that is likely to be depredated on the wing by virtue of the fact that they just move so fast and they're so small. It's more that their feathers are going to wear out pretty darn quickly. The other thing about these birds is they are all female, and we don't know how, what the story is with this, and whether it is definitely a sex-linked situation. But it is fascinating. The unfortunate thing is very few of them have been banded. I think there have only been about 100 full albino ruby throats that have been studied to date, because they are rare. They really are rare, and there's so few of us ruby throated hummingbird banders in the East that the odds of being able to catch them is pretty small. I didn't mention this, but being a hummingbird bander is a specialization within hummingbird banders. And there aren't many of us, especially here in the East, where we have ruby throateds. Out in the Western US, there are more hummingbird banders because there are more species of hummingbirds. But still, even so, nationwide, there are not that many of us. And so research when it comes to hummingbirds is something that's it's very much of interest. And in some ways, we have certain aspects of it that are some of the last frontiers in ornithology. The last unknowns out there are having to do with hummingbirds, because they're just so challenging to study, and there's so few of us that are working with hummingbirds. So it really is definitely a specialty. But I honestly say that I would pay to have this privilege that I have to be able to work with these birds. It is very special. I never take it for granted. I love each and every minute of it. And every time I go out to work with a bird, it's like Christmas, because I just don't know who I'm going to find, what I'm going to find. It's really exciting stuff. Before we get into a little bit more about the research, I'm just going to talk about Hummingbird Needs. I think most of us are well aware of the fact that hummingbirds, yes, they gravitate towards brightly colored blooms. They have evolved with plants with brightly colored blooms, both up here in the northern hemisphere as well as in the southern hemisphere. And we have some good examples of native vegetation that hummingbirds use and are using right now in the woods, like coral honeysuckle that you see here. This type of honeysuckle has been cultivated, and you'll find it in garden stores in different hues of red. You may see it in yellow or orange, but this is the nominate form, the form that grows in the woods and is blooming now and is attracting hummingbirds. Hummingbirds have evolved to be able to see, especially ruby throats, they can see bright colors like red, 1/2 to 3/4 of a mile away. They are literally drawn to red flowers. And that is why they check things that are red out, even things that aren't flowers they may have an interest in, especially young hummingbirds that are quite curious. But ultimately, they're looking for brightly colored flowers that typically, like in the case of this honeysuckle, have a lot of sugar in the nectar. And they are the only ones that can reach that nectar at the base of the flower by virtue of that special tongue that I mentioned. Also, Carolina jessamine. Jessamine is now finished blooming, but when it is blooming in the southeast, it pretty much coincides with the northern movement of ruby-throated hummingbirds. And so you can imagine that when your jessamine is blooming pretty heavily, that's when you may see your first hummingbird. And it's not been unusual for me to see my first hummingbird, not at a feeder, but at flowers. Because that first bird, it may be heading to Canada. It may never have ever seen a feeder, but it knows what these flowers are all about. And especially something like this, which is a native vine that it's encountered all the way up through the southeast on its journey at this time of the year, well, a little bit earlier. So jessamine is another one. There are other vines also, like crossvine, bignonia, that's blooming now too, and that's a native hummingbird favorite as well. But there are a real assortment of plants that they like, and we could make this into a whole nother talk for a whole nother night. But when we look at hummingbird plants as a whole that we plant in our gardens, that typically these are plants that have come to us from the tropics, where hummingbirds are more plentiful. There are over 360 some species in this part of the world. Most of them are found in Central and South America. There are a lot of plants down there that attract them, that have evolved with them. And as a group, the one that has the most diversity and is always a favorite, no matter what form you try, are the salvias or the sages. And I'm sure some of you recognize this plant here. Salvia Gregii, it can be referred to as harvest sage. It has been cultivated in many colors and sizes, but it typically has a bloom that's this shape. It's somewhat tubular, and it's restricted in terms of it being fairly narrow so that bees and wasps can't really get in there, but hummingbird tongues surely can. But the salvias or the sages as a group are fantastic, and you can get them, yes, in all shapes and sizes. Most of them have very brightly colored blooms, red, pink, orange. But we found that the salvia that hummingbirds seem to gravitate to more than any other kind is this one here. And notice, it is not red. It is actually, yes, it is blue. And you may see this one in shades of blue. You may see it in purple. This is Salvia Guarnetico, or Brazilian sage. I'm sure some of you have this in your gardens. It has been cultivated in just dozens and dozens of forms from its original plant down in the tropics. It is one like Salvia Gregii. It is a perennial, and it will be blooming. Mine, actually, I've got one that's going to be blooming within the next couple of days, surprisingly. I guess because I was able to keep it warm on those freezing nights that we had early on. It did come back from its roots fairly early this year, so it's going to be blooming soon. But this Salvia Guarnetica, this Brazilian sage, it will bloom from May through the summer into September, and I'll have it blooming right up until we get a heavy frost. It won't be blooming quite as heavily, but it will have blooms on it right until the point in which it gets killed back to the roots in the wintertime. But this Brazilian sage, as it turns out, it's not any sweeter than the other salvias. It turns out, once it was tested, is actually a plant that produces a lot of nectar per flower. So for the 2 or 3 days that these blooms are open, they produce a lot of nectar. And that is really what pulls the hummingbirds in, is that abundance of nectar in each one of these flowers. Hummingbird flowers have anywhere between 22 and 35% sugar in the nectar. That's pretty much what they're looking for, what the birds are looking for in terms of a sweetness. And it really, yes, it really is quite variable. But again, you can see this is a nice tubular bloom that would be hard for any other critter other than a hummingbird to get into. So they are nectaring, but they are also pollinating at the same time. And interestingly, for those of you with vegetable gardens, whether you've noticed it or not, you may find hummingbirds like flowers that pop up in the vegetable garden as well. They will nectar at okra flowers. They will nectar at basil if you let it go to seed. And they certainly nectar on rosemary. If you've had rosemary blooming this winter, they will nectar at that. I've seen some that's blooming now, so certainly at the time period when ruby throats might be around. So there are a number of plants, including vines and even trees, that hummingbirds use. As long as they have that minimum amount of sweetness, they'll go for it. And that also includes tulip poplar, it includes wild azalea, it includes sourwood and basswood, both of which have white flowers like this tulip poplar. They're white flowers, but they are sweet enough to get a hummingbird's attention. And of course, they will use, if they're still blooming or if they bloom early, camellias. There are old-timey varieties that do produce nectar, and they've got this figured out. And so they will definitely use your camellias. If you have large bushes, they will use them for shelter as well. Any evergreen is fantastic shelter for hummingbirds. But hummingbirds will use surprisingly small blooms like lantana. They love Miss Huff lantana. So they're going to be nectaring right alongside butterflies in some of our smaller blooms. Though really those larger blooms that I showed you, butterflies will use them to varying degrees depending on the plant. So when you're planting for hummingbirds, you're also certainly planting for the butterflies, and just be aware that, yeah, the hummingbirds are out there and they're pollinating as they're drinking. And I'm sure they're not at all aware of it, but they are pollinating. They are important pollinators right alongside of our hummingbirds. But yes, evergreens of all kinds produce the shelter that these birds need. They do not use bird boxes. They do not use cavities, in spite of what you might see or read. I know right now there's a person that's been manufacturing hummingbird houses that are advertised in Our State magazine, and I keep forgetting that I need to call that fellow and let him know that they're wonderful looking boxes, but a hummingbird is never in a million years going to use one of those boxes. They're utilizing thick shrubbery, and as we said, they're going to be using trees for nesting. They're open cup nesters, not cavity nesters. But one of the most important things that I hope you take away from this tonight is the fact that hummingbirds are actually, more than anything, meat eaters. They eat insects. This little bird here is watching for an insect like a flycatcher would do. They'll watch for insects and they'll fly out from a perch and grab that insect out of the air. And if you don't believe me, here's a picture of one doing it. They spend a lot of time doing this, but they also fly around in the vegetation looking for insects on leaves or in pine needles or under the bark. They're very visual creatures, so they are looking very hard for their food. And they probably do eat some insects in the flowers that they visit. We just don't see them doing that, but they need lots of protein. Their heart is beating about 60 times a second. Their metabolism is very high. They cannot survive on carbohydrates alone, especially when the females are feeding the youngsters. They require a lot of protein to grow. And when they are getting ready to migrate, yeah, they're still eating insects, even though they're eating their body weight in sugar a day at that time of year, they still need a lot of protein for migration as well. So we have to think very carefully when we're using chemicals in our yards, because if these birds don't have the insects they need, they're not going to be around your yard for very long. You can have all the flowers in the world, but if those bugs that they need aren't there, they're not going to be sticking around, and they're certainly not going to be nesting nearby. They're basically feeding on insects that are small enough to fit down the hatch. They're not too picky. So whether it's flies, tiny beetles, aphids, spiders, any kind of arthropod they can find, they will eat. So yes, it is very important very important for these guys, as well as our other insectivorous friends. And quite frankly, that means any bird just about in North Carolina, except for cedar waxwings, any of our songbirds, they need insects to feed their young at this time of year. Very, very important. So these birds, very susceptible to overuse of chemicals, whether it's pesticide, whether it's herbicide. I think they're probably affected by residual chemicals of all kinds impacting the populations of these tiny insects that they rely on. So very, very important thing to keep in mind. Just one little word about predators. Hummingbirds, as I said, are susceptible to predation mainly in the nest. As adults, they may get grabbed, not by this guy. This is a Carolina mantid. This is our native praying mantis. They can get grabbed by Chinese mantids that are 2 to 3 times the size of this mantis. I've seen it happen. It's happened at flowers. It's happened at feeders. But it seems the #1 hazard for hummingbirds is spider webbing, and that being thicker spider webbing, the orb weaving spider webs that are created mid to late summer that are very large and very sticky. They can catch hummingbirds inadvertently. But remember what I said, the females need spider webbing for their nests. So they kind of live this fine line existence with spiders. We believe they also will pick insects out of spider webbing. So it's just something to be aware of. But I don't want people to go out there and remove all the spider webs, because that's not a good idea. But it's just that hummingbirds, they can see through a spider web. They can see through a transparent object like that, think they can fly through it, and they may end up in a spider web and get stuck because they just can't get the web off of themselves. But also cats can and do kill hummingbirds. So if you've got feeders or flowers and you know there are cats in the area, you want to make sure that those feeders are well up off the ground so you're not setting your hummingbirds up for trouble. Very important. Oh yeah, spider like this. These yellow late season orb weaving spiders are the ones that can cause problems for hummingbirds. I just make sure where I am that there aren't any webs right close to my feeder. That's the only thing that I don't tolerate. Otherwise, I leave the spiders alone. But I make sure that there aren't any, say, on the porch right near where the feeder is hanging, because that's maybe a recipe for disaster. So in any event, spiders can be problematic for hummingbirds. I'm just going to say a few words about feeding. We're getting tight on time here. But if you have specific questions about feeders, let me know. There are 2 styles of feeders out there. You may be aware of this. You have the reservoir style feeder, like this Perky Pet 4 fountain feeder, which has been around for a long time. The upside to these feeders, especially this particular one, hummingbirds love this Perky Pet feeder. They are drawn to it like bees on honey. And I think it has to do with the angle at which they feed there at those ports that are inside those red flowers. They can keep their head up. They can see competitors. They can see predators. They're feeding at a very natural angle. And with these reservoir style feeders, the reservoir can hold a good amount of sugar water at a time. The only thing is, reservoir style feeders, with one exception, which I'll show you in a second, reservoir style feeders, not only do they seep and drip when the weather changes, but also they can be very hard to clean because they've got all these parts and they have a very narrow mouth on the reservoir. So they can be a pain to deal with. A better option is probably going to be a saucer style feeder where all the food is contained in the base, where it's not going to be seeping or dripping. Your bees and wasps aren't even going to know there's food there. But the birds are going to be able to reach it easily. Believe it or not, a ruby throat can lick the bottom of this feeder with no problem at all when it gets close to empty. So having a feeder that is easy to clean is important, in addition to having one that doesn't seep or drip to cause it to attract bees and wasps. Being easy to clean is critical because in this climate, we need to be cleaning our feeders if we're maintaining them. If we have feeders, we need to maintain them, and that means cleaning them starting now, about every 4 days, or else they're going to start to get moldy. And a feeder like this Humzinger saucer style feeder is easy to just pop apart and clean with hot water and refill, no problem. You can see this feeder also has a built-in ant moat there at the base of the hanger. You put some water in there and it'll keep the ants from getting into the feeder, which is important. The only problem I find with that ant moat is it's too small. I have chickadees, titmice, all kinds of birds, goldfinches that are shimmying down that post and drinking that water. So I typically have an ant moat like this one here hung above my feeder that's nice and roomy that I can put a lot of water in to create a better barrier to the ants. The feeder that I've got depicted here is the only reservoir style feeder that does not seep or drip. This is specially designed. It's been on the market for probably about 12 years now. And it was made, believe it or not, by somebody here in North Carolina. Dr. J.B. Whalen in Charlotte, a retired radiologist, came up with this idea for this feeder because he loves hummingbirds. And he wanted a feeder that wasn't going to drip, that would be easy to clean. And he definitely has a winner. I didn't get to know him until after the feeder had been designed, but it was pretty clear to me that he had a real good idea on his hands. It's a feeder that is easy to clean. The birds like it. The design is very safe. The feeding ports are large enough that the birds can feed easily from the ports. It doesn't attract bees or wasps. This feeder can actually sway in the wind and not have the food spill out of the ports. And that's because there is a specially designed baffle in the base of that feeder. But it comes apart easily into 3 parts to clean. And the beauty of this too is that you can now buy interchangeable reservoirs. This one is the original 2-cup capacity, but if you have a ton of hummingbirds, you can buy interchangeable capacities up to 80 ounces to use with this base. Pretty amazing. And there are people down on the Gulf Coast that need that capacity, and they're filling and refilling their feeders every day or two at 80 ounces of sugar water a clip. Yikes. But it is a really good feeder. That's what it looks like if you want to go search for it. It does not have yellow flowers anymore. We now know, of course, the yellow parts on a hummingbird feeder will attract wasps. So now the feeding ports are red. This is just an older model that I had. So this is what it looks like. And it is now no longer made by Dr. J and his family. It was so successful, they had to sell the business to Songbird Essentials. So you can find it online pretty easily. There are local bird stores, especially in the Charlotte area, and there may be some in your area that carry this because they're aware of the notoriety of the feeder and the connection to North Carolina. I will just say that in mentioning these feeders, and there are others that work quite well, there are feeders on the market that are downright dangerous, and this is one here. And unfortunately, this happens to be one where the manufacturer, First Nature, was trying to copy Dr. J's feeder, except they didn't do a very good job. They didn't have the baffle in the base, so this feeder, just like that Perky Pet I showed you, leaks and drips. In their infinite wisdom, they tried to make the feeding ports so small that the bees and wasps can't get in. Well, the bees and wasps can't get in, but the food still does leak out of the ports. And unfortunately, this feeder can cause bill injuries in hummingbirds because the ports are too small for them to safely feed. Bottom line is the bird feeding industry, including hummingbird feeders and feeding, anything relating to feeding, is not regulated. So there are things on the market like this that don't work very well or that are downright dangerous. So you have to be careful when you're shopping for a feeder. And when you look at the openings on feeders, the Perky Pet, as much as it makes me crazy because it seeps and drips, the birds really like it. It's got a nice wide opening at the port. The ports are about 4.5 millimeters in diameter. Humzingers, a little bit smaller than that, but still significant. And Dr. J's is a little bit smaller yet, but I pop out the flowers on my Dr. J's, and that'll give me a 7 millimeter opening, so they can easily feed in that hole. I don't recommend using any feeder that's got ports that are less than 3 millimeters in diameter, because it can cause either bill abrasion because they're trying to feed in a hole that's too small, or they may literally get their bill stuck in a hole in a port if it's too small. That literally can and does happen. So be careful. And if you track, you may attract other things if you got sugar water out. I have loads of things, including house finches right now. House finches are drinking my sugar water. Brown-headed nuthatches are drinking my sugar water. We had yellow rump warbler and ruby crown kinglet in the winter, and you can also certainly attract orioles and tanagers if you've got sugar water out, even if you're not seeing a lot of hummingbirds. They are not the only ones with a sweet tooth. So it can be fun to see who you can attract to your feeder if you've got a feeder that these birds can get into. And in the case of orioles can get into any hummingbird feeder that's made, is my understanding. They are persistent once they find a source of sugar water, and that can be fun. So the recipe is the very simple: 4 parts to water, 1 part sugar. Do not buy store-bought mixes because they often have additives, and those are very questionable at best. The preservatives the birds can taste, and they may abandon your feeder. So just use sugar and water. That's the best, the safest, and the cheapest way to go. I make it up 4 cups at a time and refrigerate what I'm not using right now in that nifty bottle. But you can also freeze little containers of it. When I make it, it will last for 2 weeks in the refrigerator. Not that mine ever does, but you can have it last for a good while if it's refrigerated, if you make a big batch. So just keep that in mind. Right now, most of us are not filling our feeders, but maybe a third of the way full, because we don't have many hummingbirds coming and feeding yet. Later in the summer, I will definitely fill my feeders all the way up. And you don't want to be using color. Using red dye is something that, again, is potentially dangerous. We know that it is unnecessary. The birds can see the red on your feeder. They don't need red liquid inside. And I can tell you that when I catch hummingbirds that have been drinking from a feeder with red dye, this is often what I see. They will pee and poop red. They may have red staining around their vent. They cannot handle the coloring. And coloring in these mixes is usually red food coloring, which is, believe it or not, a petroleum-based byproduct. And that's not something that I particularly want to be eating or drinking myself. And so I really want to avoid my hummingbirds consuming it, because clearly they cannot handle this stuff. So yeah, right now, we are now to the point where we need to be cleaning our feeders every 3 to 5 days. In the cooler months, in the beginning of the season, very end of the season, or if you're feeding in the winter, once a week is fine. But now 3 to 5 days. And you only want to use hot water, not dish detergent, because dish detergent, if you've got a feeder with plastic parts, which almost all of us do, that dish detergent will adhere to plastic very tightly. So you want to use just hot water. And later in the summer, if you need to do it because you've got mildew and you've got stuff growing in the nooks and crannies, a 10% bleach solution is just fine. But I have found that if I keep up with my feeders every 3 days or so, I don't have problems with much growing in my feeders. I can really keep up with it and keep them clean. And it is important because if your feeders get mildewy or they start to turn, you may be growing a whole variety of things in the sugar water when it spoils, including a fungus which has been found to be toxic to hummingbirds. So it really is critical, if you're going to have a feeder, that you maintain it. And if you really can't keep up with it, then it's best to garden for the birds and just forego the feeder, because it really is a responsibility. It is important to maintain your feeder if you've got one, and that is a commitment for sure. Anybody who wants to come out and see me in the summer, my banding, it has begun for the season, and I will be doing some big programs in the Charlotte area again this year. We have been doing our program, our Wild Wings program at Daniel Stowe Botanical Garden in August, nonstop, even through COVID. We figured out a way to make it work. But this year, I think we'll be back close to our normal schedule with our wild wings the first weekend in August. So there will be that coming up, where I'll be trapping and banding and just doing kind of a free-flowing program, answering questions and talking about the birds as we go. I'll also be doing we're going to have the Hummingbird Festival in Mecklenburg County at Reedy Creek County Park again this year, and that'll be, I believe, around the 19th of August. That'll be the day, I think, this year where I'll be banding. So I'll be doing those two programs in the Charlotte area, in addition to other programs that I do around the state. And it's great to be able to come out and see these birds up close. This wire cage trap is my preferred method of catching them. I basically just bait it with a feeder where they're used to coming to feed, and I just sit there and wait, kind of like fishing. You wait till they come for the bait, and then you close the door, and I'll use the smaller doors on the side to reach in and take the birds out. And processing them is pretty similar to working with other birds, except in the case of hummingbirds, we put on a very tiny band that, instead of being engraved, is laser printed with a unique number letter combination, and that is our permanent marker. I spend about 10 to 15 minutes with each bird, weighing and measuring and taking photos before we let the birds go. And believe me, this process and this method of trapping, it's been developed is so that, you know, it is very safe, and also it's something that doesn't seem to phase the hummingbirds. In fact, just last week, I caught the same adult male hummingbird twice within about 15 minutes. I've been known to catch the same young bird week after week after week at Weymouth Woods, where I band each week. They really are not too phased. But the whole idea with bird banding of any kind is that you're going to hopefully gain information, gain data on these birds over space and time. And so catching them within the season is great. We get really excited when we catch them from year to year, because that gives us a lot more information on longevity, movements, and other things. So there are a number of questions that we're looking at with the banding efforts here in North Carolina, but a lot of it is still just basic descriptive work. Even though I've been doing this for 20 years, it's still, in a lot of ways, still what I'm doing is in its infancy. But putting these bands on the birds is the only way I really have to study individuals. I wish there was a way I could do it that didn't involve interfering with them, but it's just not possible. But the methods that I'm using are methods that have been used for a long time and have been proven to be pretty safe and really don't phase these birds. Of course, when I'm doing these programs, the best part is letting them go, and they take off from somebody's hand, whether it's a child or an adult or a senior citizen. It's the excitement's always the same. So it's a lot of fun. And then by late summer, you know, migration gets going and starts in late July, but we'll go for quite some time. We'll have lots of hummingbirds around until sometime in September, when things start to slow down. And they'll be migrating through September, even October now. Most of October, we'll have Ruby Throated still here to some degree. But unfortunately, they don't go as flocks or as family groups. They actually go independently of one another. So it's pretty amazing, just like they do in the spring. And there's a little male up in the mountains last October. They sometimes can linger quite a while before that real cold weather seems to push them southward. But then in the winter, I also have the beauty of being able to work with these winter hummingbirds like rufous hummingbirds. This is a male, this is a female. And that's something we can talk about another time. So I'm lucky not just work with ruby throats in the summer, but other hummingbirds in the winter months. It's pretty exciting stuff. And here in North Carolina, we have the proud distinction of having documented the second highest number of species of hummingbird right next to Arizona, and Arizona is at the top of the heap. So it's been pretty exciting stuff to see some of these hummingbirds that shouldn't be here and see them multiple times. Just this past winter, I recaptured a female Allen's hummingbird in Charlotte. She was one that I banded as an adult last year. She came back to the exact same feeder this winter. It was pretty darn exciting to see her, because we had never ever documented an Allen's hummingbird in North Carolina coming back for a repeat visit. That was pretty much the highlight of my winter this winter. So thank you to all the people that support what I do, and the photographers, the friends of mine who have provided a lot of the photos that you saw tonight, and all of these people, especially in the winter, that allow me to come and visit them. But I have lots of folks in the summer too that I interact with. And if it weren't for the folks that let me come and get to know the birds in their yard or at their feeder, I wouldn't be able to do this, and to be able to go to the places that I go, the parks and the botanical gardens. If I couldn't do that, I really wouldn't have as much to show for what I do. So that's pretty much it. If you want more information, you can go to the website, or check out our Facebook page. There, I'll be posting our events for this year. And there will be events starting in June. There will be 1 or 2 events in June, a couple events in July, but August tends to be the busiest time. And if you have questions or anything, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. That's my email right there. And if you have an interesting hummingbird story or an interesting hummingbird show up or a hummingbird next winter, I'd love to hear from you. That's pretty much it.
So we have a lot of questions, and you answered a bunch of them
Good.
along the way. So I'm just going to skip over some of those. One of them was, what type of tree do they prefer to nest in? Or
There is no preference, unfortunately, and that's why I was vague about it.
Okay.
They'll use pine trees, they'll use hardwood trees. They have to have trees that out towards the end of the branch, the diameter of that branch is still about the width of your finger. So they may nest in a larger dogwood, but they tend to need to be a little bit trees that are larger in size. So they're not going to use shrubs or smaller shade trees typically.
Well, and like you said, they like to be up high. So
they do too. Yes, they prefer to be up higher.
So the idea of buying something called a cocoon nest, is that helpful at all?
No.
Yeah.
No.
Sort of like the bird box.
Yeah, pretty much the same as the bird box. There is one item that you may see on the market, although it's not appropriate here in North Carolina, but it does work in places like Texas where there are black-chinned hummingbirds. There is this little forked apparatus that looks like it mimics a forked branch of a tree. And it has been created based on what black-chinned hummingbirds have been known to use in Texas in these odd situations where they nest around people, literally in sheltered, man-made shelters. And they are the right proportions that a female black-chinned can make a nest on this little artificial thing. It works for black-chins. I've never known it to work for ruby throats. So yep, anything that you see like that for ruby throats, it's probably just a cute gimmick. It's not something that's going to really function.
Okay. So what's the best way to get them out of the garage if they get in there?
The best way to get them out of the garage is to turn the lights off, open the door, and put a feeder in the doorway. They're going to fly to the feeder eventually. They will get hungry enough to go to the feeder, and when they go to leave, they will not fly back in the garage. They will fly towards the light. They will fly out. Instinctively, they fly towards light. And so that's why sometimes just turning the lights off in the garage will cause them to fly towards the doorway and then to go outside.
Okay, that's relatively easy.
Yeah.
One of the questions was about, do they prefer native species of plants? And I guess of bugs for that matter. Yeah, no, because the Brazilian sage is definitely native.
Yeah, they there are, as I said, there are things, there are native bee balm. We have native lilies that they use. There are lots of native plants that we know that they utilize. But if you have a garden that's got natives and non-natives, they're going to be everywhere, trying everything. And
they're not very specialized.
No,
which is a good thing.
not.
Good for them, right?
No, they're not. Yeah, but I mean, certainly for us, native plants are easier to grow. They require less care, less water. I always give people native suggestions alongside of my sort of top 10 suggestions, which I can send to you all. I have a handout on that.
Oh, that'd be great. So we can share with everybody.
Right. Yeah. So if folks are looking for something new to plant this year, it gives you some ideas. And some of these plants do just fine in planters. You don't need a lot of space. Some of these things like that salvia, if it gets too big for where it is, this is the beauty of tropical plants. You can give it a pruning midway through the summer, and then it'll bounce back and it'll bloom probably more heavily in late summer than one would that hasn't had a haircut.
Right. It's a tough plant. Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. A lot of these things are the salvias and the other tropicals, that the tropical type stuff that I plant, that is perennial. I've got a lot of perennials coming back right now. And they're no muss, no fuss type things that'll take a lot of abuse, thankfully, because I don't have the time or patience to deadhead and worry over my plants and give them a lot of fertilizer and that kind of stuff. So yeah.
Where's the best place to hang a feeder?
It does not matter. Really, the best place is where you can see it easily, because that's why you are hanging a feeder. It is more for you than it is for the birds. As difficult as this is for some people to hear, there have been hummingbirds here a lot longer than there have been hummingbird feeders. And it's just, our advent of the feeder has meant that we can pull them into where we can see them and where we can enjoy them. But they'll find a feeder regardless of where you put it. But I would say put it where you can easily enjoy it. And there are now feeders that are made to adhere right to your window. And as long as they've got some sort of way to keep the ants away, like they do, some of them do have built-in ant moats, you can have them feeding right there outside your window. They'll get used to that. They'll do it, no problem. So wherever you can enjoy it, that's the best place to put your feeder. Now, if you want to reduce competition in your yard, hang more feeders and space them out so one bird does not dominate more than one feeder. But literally, the more feeders you have up, or the more you plant, the more hummingbirds you're going to see in the middle to late summer.
Awesome. Okay. So the 4-to-1 water to sugar ratio holds. We should use refined white sugar. Does
just
it have
plain
to be
table sugar? Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Does it have to be organic?
Yes. Just plain sugar. I would steer away from the turbinado or anything that might have some molasses or anything like that. It's got to be just pure sugar is what you want to be using.
Okay. And there were a couple of people asking for when you're going to be in certain areas, but they could check your website for that.
They can check the web. Facebook in particular is when I'll be posting things, and I'm going to be posting the bigger programs that we now have pretty much set in stone are going to go up here pretty soon. Yeah.
Okay. And the final question, because some people answered questions for me there. That was very nice. Thank you all. Do they feed on red rose bushes?
No.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of any roses that they like. Now, that's not to say, you might see them poking into various red flowers, just checking out to see if there's any nectar in there. They are to some degree going to check things out. And there are things, it used to be that you could find old-timey red geraniums that still had nectar. There are some petunias that have nectar. Oddly enough, there's some of the newer wave petunias actually have nectar. Some azaleas have nectar, but it's really kind of hit or miss. So, and they'll find these plants. So they do some experimentation, but as far as I know, there aren't any varieties of rose that have nectar to make them interesting of interest to hummingbirds.
Okay. And so one more question about the organic sugar. So it's not going to hurt to use organic sugar, but it's not necessary.
No, it's not critical.
Okay. Okay. This was awesome. You have lots of thank yous, and that this was a great presentation.
Great. And like I said, if people have further questions or stories or, anything, they can certainly reach out to me. I don't have any problem with that. And keep posted about our programs for this summer, and hope to see some of you out there, and we can, spend some time really looking closely at a few of these birds, right in the hand.
That would be awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Sure.
And we'll post this in about a week or so on our YouTube channel. Thank you, guys.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Bye.